ceasefire deal within 50 days. Well, let's talk about the latest developments now. I'm joined live by Ivo Daalder. He's a former US ambassador to NATO. Thanks for being with us here. You know the inner workings of NATO. Has the Secretary General, Mark Rutte, managed to turn President Trump from an antagonistic position towards NATO and Ukraine, and a warm one for Russia, into just the opposite?
Well, Rutte clearly has done everything he can to get President Trump to be more cooperative within the alliance than he was in his first term, and in some ways that he has succeeded. He had a very successful summit meeting a few weeks ago in The Hague, where the NATO countries agreed that they would spend 5% of GDP on defense and defense-related matters. That was a major victory for not only President Trump, but for Mark Rutte to get that done. Rutte smartly, I think, to my sense, said that this was all because of Donald Trump. What he didn't say is it was because many allies in Europe are so afraid that the United States is no longer a trustworthy ally, that's why they're actually spending more money given the threat that Russia poses. But again, this turnaround on Ukraine, with weapons now being sold to Europeans so they can provide weapons to Ukraine, is another step in the direction of a president becoming more mainstream when it comes to both Russia, Ukraine, and NATO.
And on that, this workaround where it'll be the European partners that will buy the US weapons, NATO acting as a sort of clearinghouse to get them to Ukraine, does that deliver what Ukraine needs while still allowing President Trump to stick to his promises of not spending American money on foreign wars?
Well, yes, it can, and it depends. The details are still to be worked out. When it comes, for example, for the most important weapon systems, Patriots, one of the reasons the Pentagon decided to halt the transfer of these weapons, something that President Trump himself has said, is there just aren't a lot of them around anymore because so many have been used, both in the Ukraine war and, importantly, in the defense of Israel and the defense of Qatar following the strikes on Iran. So the question is, where are these weapons and how are they going to get to Ukraine? The Europeans have some capabilities that they have held back because they also want to be able to defend themselves. The Germans and the Norwegians have indicated that they're willing to send their systems and then buy replacements from the United States. But are they going to be first in line, or is it going to take 3 or 4 or 5 years for those systems to actually appear on their doorsteps? Those are the kinds of details that matter. But, and that's an important but, I think President Trump has now understood that what Ukraine needs is to defend its cities from the bombardment that is being unleashed night after night after night at incredibly high levels by Vladimir Putin's Russia.
And we heard the President and the Secretary General talk about that in the Oval Office today. Just this other point of the President threatening Russia with 50 days to make a deal. What's the logic there? It doesn't appear that there have been substantive discussions before now.
Yeah, no, I think it's a little problematical. Why 50 days? Why not 30? Why not 20? Why not 2 weeks, which is the normal time frame that President Trump tends to refer to. In some ways, I think this is an effort by the president to deflect the pressure on Congress to pass this massive sanctions bill that has been being pushed through in the Senate, and he has succeeded because the Senate Majority Leader has now announced that he will not proceed with voting on this sanctions bill because the president is going to do it by himself, abdicating congressional role and responsibility in foreign policy, which is worrisome, but also basically telling the president, you can do whatever you want. And what the president wants is significantly less than what the Senate bill would have promised. So on the one hand, yes, good, again, for the president to be pushing Russia at a time that it needs to be pushed. On the other hand, a president who wants to have complete control over all levers of power, not only to implement them in case he needs them, but frankly, to pull them back. And when it comes to Russia, the one country in the world that does no tariffs on it after the United States put all the tariffs on, we haven't seen this president, putting the kind of pressure on Russia that it deserves. And hopefully that will now change, but that remains to be seen.
Just on that point of sanctions, Do you think, we've seen the weapons moving now, or at least a process for them? Would more stringent sanctions kind of deliver that pincer movement that perhaps is needed at this point?
So the key to the Senate bill that the president seemed to refer to are what's called secondary sanctions. These are sanctions, or actually on countries that are importing Russian energy products, primarily oil, but also gas. And indeed, the United States continues to import uranium for its nuclear reactors. And what the president was talking about was putting 100% tariffs on all goods imported from countries that continue to have and buy Russian oil and gas. He has in mind, of course, China, but also India. Japan, by the way, also gets gas from Russia, as do some European countries. So the idea would be to incentivize those countries to find other resources, other avenues for their energy supply, in order to reduce the kind of money that Russia has had and continues to receive for its energy exports, which have been in turn fueled its war economy that has been directed against Ukraine. So the idea is smart. But it will take more than 50 days for these countries to find alternative resources for energy. And then again, we'll have to see whether he's willing to follow through. After all, he's also negotiating with China, with India, with Japan, trade agreements that are unrelated to this issue, so making it that much more complicated. All of which suggests that this still needs a lot of work, a lot of thinking, a lot of detail before we can actually see some real results.
Now, Mark Rutte, when he was sitting in the Oval Office, said today, if I was President Putin listening to President Trump and all that lies ahead, I'd be seriously rethinking my plan here, or words to that effect. How do you think President Putin is viewing what happened today?
Well, he's had a 6-month free ride in which the United States sided with Russia, both at the United Nations, not once, but twice, rhetorically and every other way, and pulling back on the kind of support that the United States was giving to Ukraine. And in that regard, he's now in some ways facing a return to where the situation was under President Biden, with the important proviso that the United States will not be paying for any weapons that are going to be heading towards Ukraine, which means that the total amount of capabilities going will still be less probably than it was beforehand. So if I were President Putin, I would be disappointed in the fact that he appears to be losing President Trump as a friend and an ally. But in many ways, I don't think this is going to have a lot of influence on Putin, who has made very clear what he needs and wants is the total subjugation of Ukraine, and he will continue to fight at an incredible cost to the Russians. Over 1 million Russian casualties, according to The Economist, have been suffered in the last 3 years. That's an extraordinary amount when you think about it, and yet he continues to fight this war.
And Ivo, just briefly, the one thing we didn't hear President Trump talk about today, which he has in the past, is a meeting between himself and President Putin. He spoke of how friendly they are on the phone and how many phone calls they share, but we didn't hear that same desire for a face-to-face meeting. Is that likely to happen?
No, I think it's less likely to happen, in part because clearly in the last couple of weeks, what President Trump has experienced is that when he talks to Putin, he has a very good and useful conversation, perhaps frank, but certainly friendly. And then nothing changes. In fact, the war has escalated. The air war in particular has escalated. And he has finally come to the realization, he said so publicly, that Vladimir Putin talks a great game, but he doesn't.
Okay, we seem to have lost Ivo there. That was Ivo Daalder, former US ambassador to NATO, joining us there now. The UK's media watchdog Ofcom announced an investigation into the BBC documentary Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone, after a report for the BBC found that it had breached editorial guidelines